key issue. Welcome to the AFA Presents. Thank you for joining us tonight. Our topic tonight is a discussion of current moral, educational, and fiscal issues. The key issue dominating most news stories and placing number one on most folks' list of concerns is a fiscal and economic crisis facing our nation and indeed the world. We're going to discuss these fiscal issues tonight, but we're also going to discuss some key moral and educational issues. Our guest tonight is Frank Russo, President of the American Family Association of New York. Frank also serves on the Executive Committee of Long Islanders for Educational Reform and served for 14 years on the Executive Committee of the Nassau Conservative Party. Frank was a former division manager with AT&T and Verizon, is married 48 years with 7 children and 31 grandchildren. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you.
My guest host tonight is Patty Knapp, and Patty will be asking the first question.
Thanks, Connell. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you.
Frank, number one on Americans' list of concerns and priorities right now is the fiscal crisis. And as Connell mentioned, it's not just facing us here in America, but across the world. You have a great deal of business experience. You have a master's in business. Where do you see things heading, and what's your view on our economic problems facing us down the road?
Well, one of the problems that's really affecting our economy as well as many other countries is what's going on in Europe. And the euro is in serious trouble. I think personally that we're probably going to see a breakdown in the Eurozone. We're going to see Greece probably, or Italy or Spain, possibly going bankrupt. I just don't see that the countries there are going to face up to their low productivity problems, which is due to overcompensation and a reduction in work hours and so forth, where they retire so early. So they're facing enormous problems in Greece especially, but Italy, Spain as well. I don't think they're going to face up to the problems. That's just my guess. But that, coupled with the United States problems, which are similar and moving in the same direction, where we're accruing deficits of over $1 trillion in recent years, each year, an cumulative deficit of over $15 trillion that we're passing down to our children and grandchildren.
Unbelievable.
And then when you take Medicare and Social Security and the tens of trillions of dollars that we owe there to pay Social Security recipients what we've promised, Medicare recipients what we've promised and committed to, I believe that total is well over $50 trillion in aggregate amounts that we don't have, that we're short in terms of funding. So add that to our current national deficit, annual deficits, and the cumulative deficit, I see big problems, not only for the current generation, but for the upcoming generations, our children and our grandchildren. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope we're able to face up to it and that Europe is able to face up to it.
But right now it's hard to be optimistic, that's for sure.
One of my jobs at AT&T in New York Tel was director of forecasting for a couple of years. I had a lot of different jobs, but one of them was, and my job, if I was forecasting it now, pretty clear, high probability, you're going to see a collapse of one or more European countries, which is going to affect the whole globe, America, China, Russia. You're going to see a devastating impact that many people are unwilling to face up to right now.
The prospects do look pretty grim. Here in the U.S., as you said, we've seen year after year of trillion-dollar deficits. Social Security and Medicare, as you mentioned, programs that are underfunded literally by trillions for future generations. Young people are having a hard time finding jobs, and retirees are earning very little on their savings. What reasonable actions do you think could be taken to help address some of these problems that would really have an impact?
And you know, both political parties are addressing it, but I'm somewhere between the Democrats, I think, are far off the mark in my mind. They're unwilling to face up to the bulk of the problem, which is excessive spending. I think the Republicans, personally, in my judgment, are wrong in opposing any tax increases. I think the Democratic problems are the problems that are causing the bulk of our fiscal crisis, but the Republicans are also unwilling to make some reasonable adjustments. For example, I would favor, the Democrats talk about raising the tax on millionaires, but they define a millionaire as someone who makes $250,000.
That might have been a millionaire years ago. It no longer is.
Right. I mean, but I do favor raising the tax on true millionaires, people whose income is $1 million a year, maybe raising it just 2% from 35 to 37%, and maybe people who earn $3 million or more raise it to 39%. That'll generate some money. That's a minor part of the correction. The big part of the correction, though, is reducing the government spending. And because of I think it's something like a $5 to $10 trillion deficit for Social Security, a $30 to $40 trillion deficit for Medicare. That's based on the next 75 years of obligations and taking the revenues versus the costs into account. We're short by those trillions of dollars. I think we've got to start all making sacrifices. I'm a Social Security recipient. I personally favor, we get increases every year equal to the CPI. I personally favor reducing the increases by just 1%. So if CPI goes up 3%, we get a 2% increase. And maybe even making an exemption for low-income people who are below 20,000 or something. Social Security is already a system that actually has a large welfare component to it. People don't even know it. Low-income people get a much higher return for the money they pay into Social Security taxes than do higher-income people. I won't go into it all, but it is a program designed to help especially low-income people. But in addition, I think we've got to make a sacrifice in the interest of our children and our grandchildren and reduce the increase by just 1% a year. In 10 years, we will have cut the annual expenditures by 9 to 10%, roughly. Medicare, we've got to make some cost reductions there, very difficult.
That's a huge chunk right there.
That is 3-4 times the size of Social Security in terms of its deficit. One simple thing that would be a small step forward would be tort reform. The lawyers oppose it. The Democrats side with the Lawyers Association. But it's a change we've got to make because doctors are paying $100,000, $150,000 for insurance to prevent being sued for malpractice insurance. We've got to put limits on that so that they can't keep raising that cost on the doctors, which then has to be passed on to patients, onto Medicare,
of course,
and onto insurance companies. We can't do it. Again, lawyers won't like this, but I think we've got to put some limits on the amount of damages. I mean, in an exceptional case where a doctor is grossly deficient, then
yes.
you make. But right now, all the doctors are paying much more in medical insurance costs than I think is reasonable, and they have to pass it on to the rest of us.
It's exorbitant, yes.
Government has to stop wasteful spending. Solyndra, $500 million. Not $500,000, $500 million, $500 million on this wasted project that President Obama thought deserved taxpayer investment. We lost it. Taxpayers lost $500 million.
And a lot of people really aren't clear on what happened there because a lot of the media that it tends to be controlled by Democrats, shall we say, unless people are reading or listening to conservative media, they have no idea that that came out of taxpayer money and how much it was.
That's right.
And the same with the Medicare and the Social Security issues and tort reform, as you mentioned. The average person doesn't have a full picture of the impacts that these issues could have if we got them in control.
Another area that both parties, I think, are to blame is farm subsidies. Many farmers are very well-to-do. And we're still providing farm subsidies in the billions of dollars per year, which raises the cost of food to our people. It hurts competition from foreign countries that could then help lower our food prices and lower the rate of inflation and so forth. And it's an area where I think we've got to reevaluate and reduce the amount of farm subsidies that we're giving to the largest farmers in our country who have a tremendous lobbying influence on both political parties. The final area is the federal government gets involved with education. I think they've got to watch the amount of money they're giving to colleges, for college, the Pell Grants and so forth, because college costs are going up much more than they ought to be going up. And they're going up in part because the federal government is putting so much money into it that it makes it easier for them to raise tuition, since the tuition is going to be paid for in part by the government. Professors have a pretty good job, teaching 8-10 hours a week. Yes, they have to mark a lot of papers, but I think we're at a point now where the federal government should watch the level of payments it's making, because its impact is raising the cost of college for everybody, even those who don't get federal grants.
Interesting point.
Yeah, and one final thing, Chuck Schumer, he's come out with an education tax credit bill for colleges, but he won't include K-12. I've written him twice on this, and he won't do it. If they include K-12 for tax credits for people who send their children to non-public schools, this will benefit all taxpayers, because 90% of the private schools are religious schools which do the job for less than half the cost of the public schools. And so this will save a lot of money for states and local communities and their school districts if the federal government would give the same tax credit it wants to give for college costs to K-12. He won't do it, though, because Chuck Schumer puts the interests of the teacher unions over here and the interests of low-income parents who want to send their kids to a religious school down here. He sides with the teacher unions over the urban poor.
He can't point out any negatives because there's no negatives.
That's
and
right.
The children actually get a better education.
Better education and save the taxpayers money, and he won't do it because the public school teacher unions are opposed.
It's a win-win. Frank, let's take a look at New York State. Next to Illinois and California, New York State is probably in the third worst financial condition of any state in the country. What's contributing to New York State's financial woes, and what can be done about it?
The two biggest components to our budget of over $130 billion is healthcare and education. Those are the two biggest components. And healthcare, it's basically Medicaid is the biggest. We have the biggest Medicaid program in the country, bigger than California, bigger than Texas, even though they have almost double our population. We've got to put some, again, tort reform would be one thing to help. But in addition, we've got to tighten up that spending. We've really got to maybe raise co-pays. We've got to do some things to address healthcare costs. But healthcare is a difficult issue. Education's as simple as could be, as I mentioned just before. In New York State, we spend $20,000 per pupil on average. In Long Island, it's $25,000. $20,000 on average for New York State. It's the biggest, no other state comes near us. I think the second highest state is New Jersey, and they're about 10% below us. Third largest state, highest cost state is Alaska, and they're 20% below us. Where the average for the country is 10,000, 11,000, I think. We're at 20,000. Single biggest thing we could do to save taxpayers' money and help the quality of education is provide parents with choice, especially low-income parents. If we give them a tax credit, refundable, or a scholarship or a voucher, call it whatever you want, equal to just 1/3 the cost of a public school education, at most half. And that's a public school education, excluding the cost of special ed. So it's a scholarship of $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 instead of spending $20,000. We would help improve the quality of education, especially for low-income, African-American, Hispanic, poor-income, low-income white people, give their kids a better chance at an educational opportunity, and save the taxpayers' money at the same time.
Because those parents would choose
They want
a private
private schools.
school.
But what's unfortunate is that these minority parents who want school choice more than the affluent whites are voting for Democrats, and it's often black
Ironically.
Democrats who side with the teacher unions over their own children, who will side with they put the interests of the public school teacher unions above the interests of minority children, and they vote to stop school choice and deny them school choice. When this is a win for students, parents, and taxpayers. Everybody would win with this. Ron Lauder of Estee Lauder did a study for the New York State Senate 20 years ago in the early 1990s. He concluded back then with a full parental choice system. This was advertised in the New York Times, November 24th, 1991, full-page ad. We'd save $4 billion a year, he reported to the New York State Senate on a study done at their request, $4 billion a year with a full parental choice system. Today, that would be $12 billion a year in
Wow.
annual savings. 10% of our state budget would be saved if we did this, and we'd improve quality of education, especially for low-income children.
Isn't there even an ancillary benefit to that when you inject competition into the mix, that the public schools will be forced to raise their level of...
And that was proven in Milwaukee. It worked. After 4 or 5, 6 years in Milwaukee, 20 years ago they started a voucher program. They saw finally, I think it was 6 years, the public schools started to improve too, because if they didn't improve, they'd lose more students to the competing private schools.
They had to rise to the occasion.
That's right. We've got to deal with the
Competition.
public employee unions in New York State. Not only the teacher unions, our teachers in Long Island now most of them making over $100,000. Their benefits are about $40,000. We have wonderful policemen. Father-in-law was a retired policeman. I have a lot of teachers in my family, 5 teachers in my immediate family. Wonderful people, don't get me wrong, but the police in Long Island are earning with overtime, but not with benefits, $145,000 on average. $145,000 per policeman. Add in the benefits, it's $200,000
Wow.
per policeman in Nassau, Suffolk. The poor city police, New York City policemen don't get that much, and I think their job is much rougher. We have 35,000 people who take the exam for our Nassau, Suffolk policemen. No, I'm sorry, 35,000 in Nassau and 70,000 take the exam for the police jobs in Long Island, for maybe 500 jobs that are available, and yet we're paying these absurd salaries. Binding arbitration has got to be changed. It's a faulty system of our New York State legislature that kowtows to the unions, and it's killing the taxpayers. We've got to face up to all these problems. We want to be fair to everybody. Teachers and policemen are wonderful people, I realize that, but the compensation levels have gotten out of hand.
All right, let's turn to a moral issue. Recently, New York State and Governor Cuomo passed the same-sex marriage bill, making same-sex marriage legal in New York State. Obviously, there are religious objections to this, but are there any secular or non-religious reasons not to have same-sex marriage?
There are, and I've been in many debates on this subject at Stony Brook University and elsewhere, and I don't use religious arguments because I know that many of the homosexuals in the audience would just laugh at me. They poo-poo, they could care less about the Bible. So no point in mentioning
or
those
the
arguments.
secular.
Or any secularists, that's right. Number one argument is sociological. The basic reason for literally hundreds, probably thousands of years, that society, different civilizations have given special recognition to married couples, one reason: children. The whole thing is about children. It's not about the adults, it's about children. To protect the interests of children, they want to keep marriages intact and encourage them to stay together and be self-sufficient. And that's why they give special benefits and recognitions and rights to married couples. Children, it's all about children. Gay couples obviously cannot procreate. They try to adopt children and, do it through artificial means with somebody else, but then you're basically contradicting other studies. Two recent studies just came out in June 2012. Further showing how children do best with a biological mother and father, with a mom and a dad, not with same-sex couples. The gays try to argue the other point, and they had some studies done, very flawed over the years, that were very poorly done with selected. It wasn't a normal randomly done study with statistical validation. These two studies just came out in June 2012, which everyone knows this already. Children do best with a mom and a dad. That's number one, sociological. Civil rights. The civil rights of traditional Christians and Jews and Muslims are going to be violated. In fact, they've been violated in Massachusetts and in Illinois, where they had to shut down their adoption services with same-sex marriage laws because they wouldn't allow adoption by homosexuals because of the reason I just said before. The Catholic Church, the other Christian churches, Jewish synagogues believe that children do best with a mother and a father. And they're not going to allow children to be adopted by homosexual couples. They had to close down their services, which existed for decades, providing very good services in the states of Massachusetts and Illinois. Same thing's going to happen in New York, unless there are other changes put in. So civil rights of ordinary, and another incident, there are dozens of examples, by the way, brought out by Dr. Jennifer Robach-Morse of Yale University, of cases where there's been discrimination against traditional marriage believers because of same-sex marriage laws. If a photographer doesn't want to take a job photographing a gay marriage, that person can be charged with violating the rights of these homosexuals, in spite of the fact that this person believes that's an immoral act that he or she is photographing. They're taking into court and have to defend themselves. There are literally dozens of cases of the violations of the civil rights of people who believe in the traditional view of marriage.
Knights of Columbus halls also have been called, and they rent to people they don't know it's going to be a homosexual marriage, and then
they're going to be charged with violating the rights of homosexuals. Economic arguments, these are very important, especially in this day with our fiscal crisis. If you're obligated by law to give health benefits and pension benefits, federal government, state government, local governments, to gay couples, that's going to increase the burden, increase the deficit already facing our state and federal pension funds and healthcare funds. It's going to increase those costs and worsen our fiscal crisis. And to be honest, it's not only the homosexuals. I could see heterosexuals. I mean, if I'm a person and my wife died, and I have a good friend who's living in poverty, and I'm going to have no sexual relations with him, I'm going to say, hey, Joe, Mike, Steve, if we get, quote, married, you're going to get half of my pension, or you'll get my pension if I die, you'll get my higher Social Security, you'll get my health benefits. This is going to increase the costs of private companies and the government for pension funds and healthcare funds without any justification, at a time when pensions and healthcare funds are already facing fiscal crisis.
And no one's talking about this aspect of
No one's talking about it. Then you've got physiological. Without getting into it, the sex that male homosexuals engage in is very dangerous physiologically. It's dangerous to the rectal walls. It increases many diseases, not only AIDS, but many other diseases and illnesses. So physiologically it's harmful. And by the way, for the record, for 20 years, my best friend was a closet homosexual. This is what sort of got me interested into the issue. This friend, my friend Bob, I knew from 1964 to 1984. He died in 1984. He was one of the first 5,000 to die of AIDS. When he picked it up, when he was diagnosed in 83, and I did not know he was homosexual. I even arranged for him to date one of my sisters, who, when she told me she thought he was homosexual, I got mad at her. I mean, he was a closet homosexual, got AIDS, pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, Kaposi sarcoma, died in July of 1984. My family was the big family. He had 7 kids at the time. He was godfather of my first daughter. We went to we were 90% of his funeral. If I wish I regretted not knowing enough about the issue back then to talk to him about it. And I only confirmed things. He had given me some audio tapes just before he died. He was a calypso singer. 5 years after he died, my kids were asking me for some tapes. I was going to give them the tapes he gave me. I never listened to it. Then I said, I better check it. I put on one of the tapes. It was him singing calypso. I was all set to shut it off when it went into a recording he made of a telephone call that he had with one of his gay friends, which he used language I never heard before, him using. And again, I was 98% certain he was homosexual, but I wasn't positive. This is what made me 100% positive. And I just regretted, and he did go to confession. I'll tell you, he went to confession before he died, and I suspect he repented, because at the time I didn't even know that what was going on. But any case, that's another aspect of it. Psychological, you're not born gay, which the gays argue this point all the time. There's no study that's been replicatable that shows you there's a gay gene, so to speak. No study shows this. There are psychological or environmental factors that cause people to move in that direction. There could be genetic predispositional factors. Like height is a predispositional factor related to basketball. It doesn't cause a young guy to play basketball, but if he's 6'6", he's more likely to play basketball than he's 5'6". It's a genetic predispositional factor. For homosexual men, one psychiatrist who's diagnosed over 100 gays, treated over 100 gays, told me poor hand-eye coordination is a genetic predispositional factor for males that could increase the probability. Doesn't cause it, but it'll increase the probability that a guy will have trouble bonding with his teenage friends and so forth, and he could move in the wrong direction afterwards.
Isn't there also a correlation with an absentee or very distant or cold father?
Yes, an absent parent, either parent, with body image. A poor body image is a factor. There are a lot of psychological factors, and there's a lot of literature on this. There's a sign of hope that people are not even aware of, and the gays get upset. The militant gays get upset. The ordinary gays don't. Therapy is available. It cannot reorient all gays. I'll make that clear. A lot of studies done on this. It can reorient a third almost entirely, another third somewhat, and a third it can't reorient at all. But therapy is available for those homosexuals who are unhappy with their lifestyle. It's a key fact they don't want to discuss. We've got to, look, and the media bias on this issue. This Jerry Sandusky, just convicted of molesting 10 boys. To the extent it's pedophilia, prepubescent boys, I don't relate that to homosexuality. But to the extent these boys were 14, 15, 16 years old when he was engaging in these acts, these are homosexual acts. He was married, so I'm presuming he's bisexual. I don't believe he was the father of any children. I think he adopted a bunch of children. But in any case, those were homosexual acts. But the media doesn't use this word at all to describe what Sandusky was committing with these 15-year-old boys.
No, they want to downplay that connection at all
Exactly.
costs.
And there's a relation between child abuse and homosexuality. Homosexuality doesn't cause everyone to become homosexual. Child abuse doesn't cause you to become homosexual, but it increases the probability. It's one of the causes. If you're sexually abused as a child by an adult male, if you're a male, the chances are higher that you'll move in the homosexual direction. And I know this from speaking to individuals who have personally told me this, that they were molested by a child when they were young, by an adult male or even a teenage male in 2 cases, 16-year-old males. And that one guy told me, he says, Frank, I was hooked. I had to ask him, without mentioning his name, I asked him a week later, I said, when you told me you said you were hooked, what did you mean? He was only 6 years old when he was molested. He said, I became homosexual. He knew it. So being molested can cause you to move in a homosexual direction. And homosexuals, the gays get upset with this. There are a lot of studies on both sides, but I'm all for another study. This is such an important topic. The government should authenticate and have researchers on both sides get together and research this. But most of the studies I've seen show there's a much higher likelihood of sexual abuse being committed if you have most child abuse is committed by heterosexuals, about 2/3 of it. But the fact that 1/3 of all child abuse is committed by homosexuals, and only 3% of the population, means that the likelihood of a homosexual to abuse a child is much greater. Doesn't mean all homosexuals abuse; they don't. But I'm just saying there's a correlation there, and if they dispute this all the time. And there's small studies. I agree. Let's do an authenticated study that we get both sides with experts and look at this. This is important for us all to know, for society to know.
You raise a very good point about the media downplaying this issue, and they always want to focus on the very few homosexual couples that have been together for many years and are married and are committed, when the vast majority of them are together for a very short period of time, and they have an average of something like, 320 sex partners, I've heard, in a lifetime.
And acts of violence. They're harmful relationships. Not all of them, but a much higher percentage of homosexual relationships than heterosexual.
Does all this contribute to, I've seen studies where homosexual men have a shorter lifespan than most men?
Absolutely, because of the illnesses. That's the physiological one, yes. Again, we should respect homosexuals. They're children of God just like heterosexuals. Love them. I'm against bullying and against ridiculing them. You don't do that. You don't do that to a drug addict. You don't do that to an alcoholic. You've got to respect everyone, but you don't want an alcoholic driving a plane. You don't want, in my judgment, homosexuals adopting children. I'm against that. But you must treat them with respect, love. Do not bully, do not ridicule. And
they really need a lot of compassion and a lot of prayer, because it's such a disordered life and there are so many harmful consequences of it. I mean, in many instances, I think they lead very tragic lives. And as you said, they have a shorter lifespan.
Okay.
Frank, you're a Catholic, and as we've been discussing, you're in support of the Church's teachings on homosexuality and on abortion, but many liberal Catholics vote for pro-abortion and pro-gay rights candidates left and right. It appears that many of them have a distorted view of the issue of helping the poor or of being compassionate. Most pro-abortion and pro-gay marriage candidates are Democrats. They're often viewed as wanting to help the poor. Are Republicans less for helping the poor, and how do we evaluate these key moral issues?
Yeah, I have a lot of Catholic friends who are very liberal, and they're pro-life, but they're voting for candidates who are pro-abortion rights, pro-same-sex marriage. I wouldn't say they have a distorted view of helping the poor. They truly want to help the poor, and I admire that. But so do the conservatives want to help the poor. There is a difference in these issues, though. Abortion, homosexual activity, 100% of the time, objectively speaking, it is seriously sinful in the eyes of the Catholic Church and the eyes of many other religions. Those acts are black and white wrong. Kill a baby, an unborn baby, you have a homosexual act, or if you have a heterosexual act outside of marriage, adultery, fornication, serious sinful acts. Black and white, no debating it. Now, helping the poor. I only know of one person that was against helping the poor. Ayn Rand, if you're familiar with her, a brilliant woman. I see her on TV. She's written a lot of books, The Fountainhead, a lot of Atlas Shrugged and so forth. I don't agree with her. She's a libertarian type. She says no obligation to help the poor, no obligation to help someone who's drowning in a pool and all this kind of thing. But other than her, and there must be others, I have never heard any politician, Republican or Democrat, say there's not a serious obligation to help the poor. We have an obligation to help the poor. Question is, how do you help the poor, and to what degree? Do you give them $50,000 a year or $20,000 a year in aid, equivalent aid of food and shelter and clothing and so forth? How do you help them? Is it with clothing and food, or do you give them a better education? Now, here's where I fault the liberals. The liberals and the Democrats, who want to help the poor, and I think they really do, are hypocritical on the key issue of education. This is a major, most of the poor African Americans, Hispanics, poor whites, they don't want affirmative action and be given special privileges and being promoted or hired just because of their race or their ethnicity. No, they want a good education because they're going to be then the best qualified person for many jobs. They want a good education, and they know they're not getting it in many of our public schools. But who is it that wants to give them the right to choose a school of their own choosing? It's the Republicans, by and large. Just about every voucher bill is introduced by Republicans. In Milwaukee, it was introduced by a conservative Republican governor and a black liberal Democrat assemblywoman, Polly Williams, in 1990, 22 years ago. So that was good. I admired Polly Williams. And there are many blacks are coming over to this now. They want school choice. Look at President Obama. 2 wonderful daughters. He sends them doesn't send them to D.C. public schools. He sends them to Sidwell's Academy at $65,000 a year. He spends but will he give his fellow black Americans in D.C. the right to pick a school for 1/10 that price? Literally, much, much cheaper price through opportunity scholarships. He was against it. Barack Obama opposed the Opportunity Scholarship Program, which was for giving low-income blacks and others in D.C., low-income people, though, to give them a right to go to a private religious school at a cost way under half the cost of the public schools.
And a better education. Very hypocritical.
Better education. And this phony Obama opposes giving him that choice. Why? Because the teacher unions are on the other side. So Barack Obama had to choose between the public school teacher unions, who give him millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars in funding and support, versus the poor blacks and Hispanics in D.C. who want a better school opportunity through a scholarship. He chooses the teacher unions over his fellow blacks.